I went camping alone in the forests of Oregon late one fall, choosing a spot well away from the trailheads and campsites. I wanted the kind of solitude you only get when you're miles from anyone else, the kind where you hear nothing but the wind through the trees and the occasional call of an owl. I had hiked most of the day with a heavy pack, weaving my way deeper into the woods until I found a flat patch of ground not far from a stream. I set up my small two-person tent, built a fire, cooked a simple dinner, and then let the dark settle around me. The air was crisp, and by the time I crawled into my sleeping bag, the fire was reduced to glowing embers. The woods felt still that night. Too still, maybe, but at the time I welcomed it. I drifted off with only the faint sound of water trickling somewhere beyond the trees. When I woke, it was sudden. My eyes opened into blackness so complete that I couldn't even see the thin nylon wall of my tent. I wasn't sure what woke me, but then I heard it. A sound that didn't belong to the usual night noises. It was footsteps. Slow, deliberate steps moving around my tent in a steady circle. Not the light, scattered steps of a deer, not the shuffling of an elk breaking through brush. These steps had weight, and they came in a rhythm: pause, step, pause, step. Whoever or whatever it was kept a distance, never brushing against the tent, never crashing into branches. It was too controlled, too measured. I froze where I was, buried deep inside my sleeping bag. I had my bear spray and a knife in my pack, but the idea of unzipping the tent to reach for them felt impossible. The zipper would be too loud, and I couldn't bring myself to make a sound. I listened. The footsteps circled once, twice, 3 times. I tried to tell myself it had to be an animal, a deer curious about my camp, maybe even a bear being cautious. But animals don't walk in circles like that. They wander, they dart, they stop to sniff or graze. This pacing was different. It had intent. Minutes dragged by. I don't know how long I lay there, but I know it stretched far past what my nerves could handle. I could hear my heartbeat pounding in my ears, and I tried to control my breathing so it wouldn't sound loud inside the tent. The steps would slow, then speed up slightly, then slow again. Always around me, always circling. At one point, they stopped altogether. The silence pressed in, heavy and suffocating. I strained my ears, waiting for another step, but nothing came. I thought maybe it was over, that whoever or whatever it was had moved on. Then, faintly, the sound started again on the opposite side of the tent, like they had just been standing there, waiting. 40 minutes of this. That's how long it went on, though it felt like hours. Eventually, the steps grew fainter, moving away into the woods. I didn't dare move. I didn't dare sleep. I lay stiff and alert until the black sky above my tent finally softened to gray with the first light of morning. When I finally unzipped the tent, the forest was calm again. The air was damp and cold, and my fire pit was long dead. I stepped out cautiously, scanning the trees, expecting maybe to see an elk trail or signs of an animal. But the ground around my tent told a different story. There were no animal tracks, not a single hoof print, not even disturbed soil the way a bear might leave behind. Instead, in the soft dirt and pine needles, I saw faint impressions. They weren't clear enough to show detail, but they were long, narrow, and shaped like shoe prints. Someone had walked around my tent for nearly an hour in the middle of the night. I stood there, staring at those prints, feeling my stomach drop. They weren't fresh enough to see tread, but they were unmistakably human. The thought that someone had found me, deep in those woods where I hadn't seen another person all day, made my skin crawl. Whoever it was hadn't spoken, hadn't revealed themselves, hadn't tried to come closer. They had just circled me over and over again in silence. The forest no longer felt like solitude, felt like exposure. I packed my gear as quickly as I could, my hands shaking as I shoved everything into my backpack without the usual care I took. I didn't bother cooking breakfast. I just wanted out. The trail back felt longer than the hike in, every crack of a branch or rustle of leaves sending a jolt through my chest. The strangest part was that the prints didn't lead anywhere clear. They faded into the woods as if whoever it was had known how to step lightly, how to keep from leaving a trail. That detail stuck with me because it suggested experience. It wasn't some lost hiker stumbling across my tent. This was someone who knew how to move quietly and deliberately in the forest. By the time I made it back to my car, the parking area was empty. No other vehicles, no signs of anyone else out there. The whole way home, I replayed the night in my head, trying to make sense of it. If it had been an animal, there would have been tracks. If it had been some careless person, they would have left clearer signs. Instead, it felt like whoever circled me had done it on purpose, just close enough to be heard but not seen, just long enough to make me understand they were there. I didn't camp alone again after that. I still hike, still love the outdoors, but that night left me with a different kind of awareness. Out there in the woods, away from the world, you think you're alone. You think the danger is wild animals or the weather, but sometimes the danger is something else entirely. Someone who finds you, watches you, and lets you know in the quietest way possible that you're not nearly as alone as you thought. That morning in Oregon, staring at those faint shoe prints in the dirt, I realized that the silence I had once welcomed in the forest wasn't peaceful at all. It was a silence that could hold anything, even the sound of footsteps that stop just long enough to make you wonder where the person is standing and what they want. I left with the uneasy truth that I hadn't been camping by myself after all. I still think about that night in the Appalachian Mountains. It was supposed to be a simple trip, just a quick weekend getaway with a friend from college. We both loved hiking, and since neither of us had much money, camping was the easiest way to feel like we were escaping everything. Classes, city noise, and deadlines. We drove out with a couple of backpacks, a borrowed tent, and a cooler, thinking it would just be another adventure we'd look back on and laugh about. Instead, it turned into one of the most unsettling experiences of my life. We hiked in for most of the afternoon, following a narrow trail that wound up and around steep slopes. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, and the forest felt alive with birdsong and the rustle of leaves in the breeze. By the time we picked a campsite, the sun was sinking low, and the shadows stretched long through the trees. We found a clearing that was flat enough for the tent and close enough to a small stream where we could get water. It wasn't an official campsite, just a quiet spot off the trail. That made it feel more adventurous, more secluded. We set up the tent, gathered some fallen wood, and got a small fire going. Dinner was just hot dogs and instant noodles, nothing special, but everything tastes better out there. After we ate, we sat by the fire until the stars came out. The night sky in the mountains is endless, sharp with thousands of points of light you never see in the city. By then, the forest had gone quiet except for the occasional chirp of an insect or the faint hoot of an owl. We put out the fire and crawled into the tent. The ground was hard, and the air cooled quickly, but I was tired enough to drift off. I don't know what time it was when I woke up, but it was deep in the night, the kind of dark where you can't see your hand in front of your face. At first, I thought it was just the usual noises of the woods, the kind you tune out after a while. But then I heard it clearly, a scream. It was high-pitched, sharp, and carried through the trees like it was being funneled straight to us. My first thought was that it had to be a fox. I'd heard they could make sounds like that, or maybe a bobcat, but this didn't fade the way animal cries usually do. It dragged on, splitting the silence, and then stopped abruptly. I lay there frozen, my heart thudding in my chest. The scream came again, this time from a slightly different direction. It was closer. The pitch wasn't even. It rose and fell like someone gasping for air in between. It sounded wrong, too human. I didn't move. My friend didn't either. Neither of us said a word. The tent felt paper thin, like the only thing separating us from whatever was out there was a thin sheet of fabric. The screams kept coming, spaced out just enough to make the silence in between unbearable. Sometimes it seemed farther away, then suddenly it was closer, sharper, like it was drifting through the forest. The sound carried differently depending on where it came from. I strained my ears to figure out if it was circling us or just echoing strangely through the mountains, but I couldn't tell. Lying there, I kept running through explanations in my head. An injured animal, a fox, a bobcat, but the longer I listened, the more convinced I became that it wasn't an animal at all. It sounded like a person, someone screaming until their voice cracked. At one point, the sound was so near I swore it was just beyond the trees at the edge of our clearing. I felt every muscle in my body tense, and I held my breath. The scream rose, choked off, then silence. I couldn't hear footsteps, but the stillness outside felt alive, like something was waiting. We didn't move. We didn't dare unzip the tent or reach for the flashlight. I kept imagining what I'd see if I looked out and caught eyes staring back. The screaming went on and off for what felt like hours, though it was probably less than an hour in reality. Eventually, it faded into the distance. The silence returned, and I lay there rigid, afraid to close my eyes in case it started again. I don't think I slept the rest of the night. When dawn finally came, it was like a weight lifted. The forest looked ordinary again, soft morning light spilling through the trees, birds chattering as if nothing had happened. But the normalcy only made the memory of the night feel stranger. We stepped out of the tent stiff and tired, barely speaking as we packed up. Neither of us wanted to linger. When we got back to the trailhead, a ranger truck was parked near the entrance. A couple of rangers were standing outside, checking a map, their radios crackling faintly. They told us there had been a report of a missing hiker in the area. The man had been gone for a couple of days, and they were still out searching. Hearing that froze me in place. Suddenly, the screams from the night before weren't just strange noises in the dark. They might have been someone calling for help, wandering lost and desperate in the woods. Or maybe it was worse than that. Maybe it was someone in real danger, crying out into the night while we lay there, too terrified to move. I don't know if the missing hiker was ever found. I never looked it up afterward, and maybe that was on purpose. The truth is, I didn't want to know. If those screams belonged to that hiker, then I'd spent the night listening to a person in their last moments, too paralyzed with fear to do anything. If it wasn't the hiker, then it was someone else out there, and that thought is just as bad. What I do know is that the mountains changed for me after that. They stopped feeling like an escape and started feeling like a place where the line between human and animal sounds, between danger and safety, blurs too easily. The memory of that scream, broken and human-like, still cuts through me sometimes when I think I hear something in the dark. That night taught me that fear isn't just about what you see. It's about what you hear, what you can't explain, and the weight of wondering afterward if you should have done something different. We left the mountains that morning with our gear and our lives, but the sound of those screams has never left me. It was one of those things I never expected to experience in my life. You read about strange moments, odd sensations, weird tricks of the mind, and you figure they happen to other people. But I went through it myself, and the memory of it has stayed with me. It wasn't while camping in the woods or hiking some deep trail. It was just at home, on a normal morning, doing something as simple as taking out the garbage. And yet it shook me in a way that being alone in the wilderness never has. It happened a couple of years ago, late summer. I think it was August because the mornings were still warm and the air had that heavy, humid feel to it. The sun had already risen. The sky was bright and clear, and everything looked exactly as it should. I remember stepping out the back door with the bag of garbage in one hand, expecting to hear all the usual things that make up a summer morning. Birds chirping, bugs buzzing, the wind stirring the trees, maybe the distant hum of a car out on the road. But the moment I stepped outside, it was like all of that just stopped. There was no sound at all. Not quiet, not a lull, but total absence. The kind of silence that presses against your ears and makes you notice your own heartbeat. It hit me hard enough that I actually froze for a second on the back step, trying to process it. The trees were still, their leaves unmoving, though I knew there had been a slight breeze just minutes earlier when I'd been inside. The birds, which I always heard in the morning, were gone. No insect hum, no far-off traffic, no planes overhead. At first I thought maybe I was imagining it, but then I noticed something even stranger. The noises I was making didn't sound right either. My footsteps on the gravel, the creak of the garbage can lid, even the sound of my breath. It was all muted, as if someone had turned the volume down on the entire outside world. It wasn't like being deaf because I could still hear, but everything was dulled, flat, robbed of depth. Even the crunch of gravel under my shoes, normally sharp and distinct, sounded muffled. I stood there holding the garbage can lid, my skin prickling. The silence wasn't peaceful. It wasn't the kind of quiet you find in the woods at dawn or in a library. It was oppressive, heavy, unnatural. My body reacted before my mind could make sense of it. My chest tightened, my pulse quickened, and a low panic started building. I felt like the world had slipped, like something was wrong with reality itself. I stayed outside, though. I don't know why. I think part of me wanted to see if it would change, if I could figure it out. I walked slowly around the yard, testing sounds. I stomped on the grass, snapped a stick, cleared my throat. Each sound came back to me dulled, like it had been filtered through a wall of thick fabric. I even clapped my hands once, hard, and instead of the sharp crack I expected, it was like someone had taken the edge off, leaving only a dull echo in the air around me. The longer I stood there, the stranger it felt. Time seemed to stretch. 10 minutes felt like half an hour. The silence didn't let up. I started to feel like I was the only living thing in the neighborhood, like the world had emptied itself and left me standing in the hollow shell of it. My skin was clammy despite the warmth, and I couldn't stop glancing at the trees, the houses, the road beyond my yard, half expecting to see something wrong with them too. But everything looked normal, perfectly normal. It was just the sound that was gone. At one point, I went back to the door and opened it, stepping inside for a moment. The instant I did, the difference hit me. Inside, everything was fine. The fridge hummed. A fan turned in the corner. My own movements made the sounds I was used to. It was like crossing a line between two worlds. I stepped back outside again, and instantly the dull, heavy silence clamped down around me. That's when I realized it wasn't my ears, and it wasn't in my head. It was something about being outside that had changed. I stood there for a few more minutes, my nerves raw, fighting the urge to just retreat inside and lock the door. And then it happened, suddenly, without warning. It was like an explosion of sound. Not a gradual return, not a slow buildup, but all at once the world snapped back to life. Birds erupted into song as if they'd been waiting for a cue. Leaves rattled in the breeze that I hadn't felt before. A car rumbled down a road in the distance. A dog barked somewhere, and the air was instantly filled with the usual background noise of the morning. It was almost too much after so long without it. My ears rang from the sudden shift, and I actually staggered a little, overwhelmed. I can't describe the relief I felt. The tension in my body drained at once, though it left me shaking. I stood there in the middle of my yard, listening to everything at once, grateful for the ordinary chaos of life returning. But even with the relief, a deep unease lingered. It wasn't just the memory of the silence, but the way it had ended, like someone had flipped a switch and turned the world back on. Eventually, I went back inside, finished with the garbage, and tried to move on with my day. But the experience stuck with me. Even now, I can remember the exact feeling of that morning, the heaviness of the air, the way my own footsteps sounded wrong, the suffocating stillness that made me feel like I was standing outside of reality. I've thought about it a lot since then, tried to explain it to myself. Maybe it was some weird atmospheric condition. Maybe it was my brain playing tricks on me, though I've never had anything like it happen before or since. Whatever it was, it changed the way I think about silence. I used to think of quiet as something calm, something peaceful. But what I felt that morning wasn't peace. It was emptiness, the absence of everything that makes the world alive. It was terrifying in a way I can't quite put into words, because it wasn't something I could see or touch. It was the lack of something I hadn't even realized I depended on until it was gone. Now, every time I step outside early in the morning and hear birds or the wind through the trees, I pay attention to it. I let it sink in, the reminder that the world is still alive and moving, because I know what it feels like when it isn't, and I don't ever want to feel that again. I've been reading a lot about old northern folklore before I decided to head out for a short camping trip. Most of it was just curiosity, stories passed down through generations that were tied to the land and the long winters. The one that stuck with me the most was the Ojibwe legend of the Wendigo. Not the exaggerated monster version that people like to tell around campfires, but the way it affected real people. There was something called Wendigo psychosis. People would believe so strongly that they were turning into a Wendigo, with this insatiable hunger for human flesh, that they would beg their families to kill them or exile them before they hurt anyone. That fact stayed in the back of my mind like a splinter. I never thought it would really matter to me, but once I was alone in the woods, it came back stronger than I expected. It was early spring when I went out, and in northern Minnesota that still meant snow, ice, and bitter air. I wanted solitude, a test against the elements, and maybe a chance to clear my head. The trail was half frozen, patches of crusty snow crunching under my boots, with slick stretches of ice in shaded spots where the sun couldn't reach. My pack was heavy, but the rhythm of walking helped. I passed through thick pine stands, where the branches held heaps of old snow, and then into open patches where the wind cut sharp against my face. The silence was already noticeable during the day. It wasn't absolute, but it was thin. Just the sound of my steps, the swish of fabric, and the faint groan of trees in the cold. I set up camp before dark in a clearing tucked between two ridges. It felt like a good spot. Some cover from the wind, level ground, and enough space to pitch my small tent. I stamped down the snow, got my shelter up, and boiled water for a simple meal. Steam rose into the air, vanishing fast into the cold. My fingers stung even through gloves, and I kept them close to the pot for warmth. By the time I finished eating, the shadows had stretched long and deep, swallowing the ridges around me. When night fell, the forest changed. Darkness spread like ink, and the cold crept deeper, finding its way into every layer of clothing. I crawled into the tent, zipped myself into the sleeping bag, and shut off my headlamp. That's when I really noticed it. The silence. Not just quiet. Not just the kind of hush you get in the woods at night where you can still hear an owl, or a coyote, or branches shifting. This was something else. A silence so complete that it felt unnatural. My own heartbeat was loud enough to echo in my head. Every breath seemed to fill the tent. When I shifted on the sleeping pad and a strap creaked, it sounded like it carried for miles. It was oppressive in a way I'd never felt before. I lay there waiting for something to break it, for a distant animal call, for the groan of ice shifting, for the whisper of wind through the trees. But nothing came. It was like the entire forest had been muted, shut down, emptied of life. The longer it lasted, the heavier it pressed on me. And that's when the thought of Wendigo psychosis came back. Couldn't help it. I thought about people trapped in long winters, snowed in, starving, left with nothing but the sound of their own breathing and heartbeat. Days or weeks of silence like this could tear at the mind. I imagined them lying awake just like I was, hearing nothing, thinking about hunger, isolation, and fear until the idea of becoming something inhuman seemed real. I tried to shake it, but the silence wouldn't let me. I'd close my eyes, and instead of sleep, I'd get flashes of thoughts I didn't want. Images of gaunt figures in the snow, of people turning on their families, of the kind of desperation that folklore tried to explain. Every time I opened my eyes, the tent was just as dark, just as suffocatingly quiet. At one point, I sat up and unzipped the flap, hoping the outside air would clear my head. The forest under moonlight was frozen and still, the snow glowing faintly, the trees standing like black pillars. It looked beautiful, but it felt wrong. The world didn't move. Nothing stirred. I stood there in my boots, breath puffing in clouds, and felt a chill deeper than the cold air itself. It was the kind of stillness that made me feel like the earth had stopped breathing. Back in the tent, I couldn't get comfortable. My muscles were tight, my jaw clenched, and I kept straining my ears for any sign of life. My thoughts circled back to the same point over and over, that the silence wasn't natural, that maybe it was the same kind of silence that broke people centuries ago, that made them believe they were cursed. I started to wonder how long I could last out here if the silence didn't lift. The hours dragged. I checked my watch again and again, each time surprised at how little time had passed. Midnight, 1, 2. My head felt heavy but wired at the same time, like I was on the edge of exhaustion and panic all at once. Once or twice I thought I heard something faint, a crack, a crunch, but it vanished before I could tell if it was real or just my brain making noise to fill the void. When dawn finally came, it was the slowest relief I've ever felt. A faint gray glow seeped into the tent, and I unzipped the flap to see the world thawing back into view. The silence was still there, but somehow it was easier to bear with light on the snow. I packed quickly, my fingers stiff, and strapped the pack to my shoulders. The hike out felt longer than the hike in. My boots crunched rhythmically, and that sound was the only thing keeping me steady. I listened for birds, for the chatter of squirrels, for anything, but the woods gave me nothing back. It was just my footsteps, over and over, until I reached the trailhead. When I finally slammed the car door shut, the noise startled me so badly that I jumped. The engine turning over felt like a wave washing through me, shaking loose the pressure that had built up. The hum of the tires on the road was almost soothing. I hadn't realized how starved I was for sound until that moment. On the drive back, I couldn't stop thinking about the night I'd spent out there. I'd gone expecting the usual: coyotes howling, branches snapping, maybe the unease of being alone. Instead, it was silence that got to me. Silence so complete it made me understand how people could start to lose themselves, how those old stories could grow into something that felt real. I learned something about myself on that trip. I could handle noise in the night, but I couldn't handle nothing at all. Out there, in the frozen woods with no sound and no movement, I felt what it might be like to stand on the edge of madness. Not because of monsters, but because of the mind turning on itself in the absence of life. And that was more terrifying than any story I'd ever read. I remember that trip to Montana so vividly because of how normal it started and how uneasy it left me feeling. We had been looking forward to it for weeks, planning every little detail. Both of us loved being outdoors, and we thought spending a few nights in the mountains would be the perfect break. We packed our small tent, sleeping bags, food, and all the usual gear, and by the time we set off on the trail, the sun was still high and the air had that clean, sharp mountain quality that makes you feel like you can breathe deeper than anywhere else. The hike in was beautiful. Pines stretched tall on either side of the trail, and patches of wildflowers dotted the open spaces where the sun slipped through. The sound of running water was never far away, and now and then we'd hear the distant call of a bird. We passed a few other hikers in the early part of the trail, but the deeper we went, the quieter it got. By late afternoon, we picked out a campsite not too far from a creek. It wasn't an official camping spot, but the ground was flat, and the trees circled around in a way that made it feel private. We set up the tent, gathered some firewood, and cooked a simple meal. The fire crackled, throwing sparks into the dark, and the air cooled quickly once the sun dipped behind the ridge. It was one of those evenings where everything seemed perfect, peaceful, calm, and far from the stress of normal life. We sat by the fire until it burned down to glowing embers, then crawled into the tent, zipped ourselves into the sleeping bags, and let the sounds of the forest lull us towards sleep. I don't know what time it was when I woke up, but it was deep into the night. At first, I didn't know why I had stirred. Then I heard it, slow, heavy breathing just outside the tent. The sound was low and steady, like whatever it was had lungs as big as bellows. The kind of breathing that doesn't come from something small. My heart picked up immediately, and I froze, trying to listen harder. A second later came the unmistakable crunch of branches. Something was moving out there, just beyond the thin fabric of our tent. Each step seemed deliberate, not like a squirrel darting around or a deer bounding off. This was slower, heavier, and close enough that I could feel my stomach knotting up. The air inside the tent felt tighter. I lay still, not daring to move, straining to make sense of the noises. In my head, I ran through what it could be: elk, moose, maybe even a bear. Out here, that wasn't out of the question at all. My body tensed at every crack of a branch, every pause in the breathing. Then, just when I had convinced myself it had to be some kind of animal, I heard something that made my blood run cold. A cough. Not a snort, not an animal huff, but a dry human cough. Short, sharp, too close for comfort. Everything inside me froze at once. The heavy breathing, the footsteps, even the idea of a bear. All of that I could have explained. But the cough was different. That sound didn't belong to any wild animal. The night outside went quiet again, except for the occasional shift of weight on the branches and the faint sound of breathing. I didn't move, I barely even let myself breathe, afraid that the sound would carry. Time dragged on, and the noises continued on and off, but never came closer than the edge of our camp. Eventually, after what felt like forever, the forest went still again. No more crunching branches, no more breathing, no more coughs. I don't think I slept much after that. Every rustle of leaves or creak of the tent fabric kept my eyes wide open. I waited for the first light of morning, counting down the minutes in my head, until the dark finally started to lift and the forest took on its usual sounds again. The birds, the trickle of the creek, the soft rustle of the breeze. When we finally stepped out of the tent, the campsite looked normal at first. The fire pit was just a pile of gray ash. The trees stood tall and still, and the stream glistened in the early light. But when I started walking the area, I noticed something just beyond where the trees thickened about 20 feet from our tent. The ground there was trampled, the pine needles flattened in spots. Scattered around were a handful of cigarette butts, half burned down and crushed into the soil. Near them were faint impressions in the dirt. Not paw prints, not hooves, boot prints. The sight made my stomach drop. Someone had been out there in the dark, close enough to watch us, close enough to make those noises we heard. And they weren't just passing by. They had stood there long enough to smoke, to leave behind several butts. The thought of it hit harder than any animal encounter could have. A bear would have been dangerous, yes, but this was worse in a different way. This was deliberate. Someone had been near our tent, breathing heavy, snapping branches, coughing, and then lingering in the trees long enough to leave a mark. I couldn't shake the unease as we packed up. Every sound around us suddenly felt different, every shadow in the woods suspicious. The whole way back down the trail, I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following at a distance. By the time we reached the car, the relief was overwhelming, but it didn't erase the fact that someone had been out there with us that night. Whoever they were, they hadn't come close to the tent or tried to do anything more, but the idea that they had stood there watching, smoking, breathing, and moving around our camp was enough to change the way I looked at camping. That trip taught me something I'd never really thought about before. Out in the wilderness, I'd always assumed the biggest danger was nature itself, animals, weather, injury. But the truth is, the woods don't just keep out the noise of the city. They also hide people. And sometimes the scariest thing out there isn't the wildlife at all, but the fact that you never know who else might be walking those same trails, standing just outside your tent in the dark, close enough to leave behind boot prints and cigarette butts you'll find only when it's too late to know what they really wanted. I haven't camped the same way since. That trip into the Canadian woods started off the way all of our camping trips did, loud, messy, and full of laughter. There were 6 of us, all college friends who tried to get away at least once every summer. We packed too much beer, not enough food, and just enough gear to make us think we were prepared. The trail we chose wasn't even that difficult. A couple of hours into the forest until we found a clearing near a small lake. The sun was dropping low by the time we pitched our tents, but the firewood was dry, the air was cool, and the mosquitoes weren't as bad as usual. We sat around the fire that night, passing cans back and forth, telling dumb stories, roasting hot dogs on sticks. The flames flickered across everyone's faces, and the woods behind us disappeared into blackness as the night pressed in. We were loud enough that any wildlife probably gave us a wide berth. By the time the fire burned low and the cooler was half empty, we were all ready to crash. It was just after midnight when we split off into our tents, each pair or single peeling away into the dark. My tent was small, just enough space for me and my pack. I laid back in my sleeping bag, the thin nylon wall of the tent separating me from the cool night air. The buzz of alcohol and the exhaustion from the hike had me heavy-limbed, and the forest was quiet in that muffled way it gets after midnight. That's when I heard it. At first, it was faint, just the sound of something brushing the side of the tent. I thought maybe it was a branch shifting in the breeze, or one of the others stumbling back from taking a piss in the woods. But then it came again, slow, long, a dragging sound that stretched across the wall just inches from my head. The sound wasn't random. It wasn't like leaves rustling or a stick scratching. It moved with purpose, steady and deliberate, traveling from one end of the tent to the other. I lay frozen in my sleeping bag, staring into the black, the thin fabric suddenly feeling paper thin. I tried to breathe quietly, afraid that if I shifted or made a sound, whatever it was would know I was awake. The dragging came again, this time starting low near the ground and moving upward in a straight, measured line. My heart was hammering so hard it felt like the noise would give me away. I told myself it had to be one of the guys messing with me. We'd pulled pranks on each other before, dumping water on tents, hiding gear, small stuff like that. But the sound didn't stop. It came in stretches, long and careful, like someone tracing the tent wall with something sharp. The dragging finally stopped, but the silence that followed was worse. I waited, ears straining, but nothing else came. No laughter, no footsteps retreating, no sound of anyone moving around camp. Just silence, thick and heavy, broken only by the distant lap of water against the shore. I didn't sleep after that. I lay stiff in the dark, counting down the seconds until the sky began to lighten. Every little noise, the pop of cooling embers, the creak of the trees, made me flinch. At some point, I realized I was gripping the small flashlight in my hand so tightly my knuckles hurt. When the first gray light bled into the tent, I finally unzipped the flap and stepped out. The camp looked normal. Tents in a loose circle, the fire burned down to ash, the lake calm and still. A couple of the others were just beginning to stir, rubbing their eyes, stretching. I walked around to the side of my tent, my stomach tight, and there it was. A long, jagged mark ran across the wall of the nylon, starting low near the ground and climbing upward in one smooth line. The fabric hadn't been torn open, but it was scored deep enough to leave a clear scratch, like something sharp had been dragged slowly along it. The line stretched almost the entire length of the tent, impossible to mistake for anything accidental. I just stood there, staring at it, trying to process what it meant. None of the others had mentioned hearing anything strange during the night. When I asked, casually, not wanting to sound paranoid, they all shook their heads, groggy and confused. No one admitted to sneaking over and doing it as a joke. In fact, most of them laughed at the idea, brushing it off as maybe a branch or an animal paw. But I knew what I had heard. Branches don't cough against nylon, and animals don't make a straight line like that. As the sun climbed higher, we packed up camp, the scratch still glaring at me every time I glanced at my tent. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been out there in the dark, circling us, crouching close enough to drag a knife or some sharp object across the thin fabric just to see if we'd notice. And what unsettled me most was the silence. No footsteps, no laughter, no sound of anyone leaving. Whoever it was had been deliberate, careful, and close. We hiked out that morning like nothing had happened, the group laughing and joking the way we always did. But I carried the weight of that night with me the whole way back. Every time the trail curved through a shadowed stretch of forest, I found myself glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing just out of sight. When I got home, I set up the tent again in my backyard, just to look at the mark in full daylight. It was worse than I remembered, an ugly scar cutting across the nylon, unmistakably made by something sharp. I thought about how close it had been, just inches from where I was lying, and the thought made my skin crawl. None of my friends ever admitted to doing it. If it had been a prank, someone would have cracked eventually, but they never did. And if it wasn't them, then that meant someone else had been out there that night, watching us drink by the fire, waiting until we were zipped into our tents, and then pressing close enough to leave their mark. I don't know if they meant to scare us, or if it was something darker. I don't know if they lingered after that one scratch, standing in the trees watching to see if we'd come out. What I do know is that I lay awake all night listening, and I never once heard them leave. That trip taught me something I'll never forget. In the woods, the thin walls of a tent don't mean a thing. You think you're safe because you're zipped inside, but it's nothing but fabric between you and anyone who decides to walk into your camp. And sometimes, the scariest part isn't that someone was there. It's that they left without you ever knowing why. That trip to the national forest had started out like any other family outing. It was my wife, our 2 kids, and me, along with enough gear stuffed into the car to last a week if we needed it. We had picked a spot not too far from a small lake, down one of those gravel service roads where the campsites are spread out enough to feel private, but still close enough that you know you're not alone out there. The weather was perfect. Clear skies, cool air in the evenings, warm in the day, and we felt lucky to have found such a quiet place. When we pulled in that afternoon, I noticed another tent had been set up about 100 yards away. It was a small, one-man tent, pitched neatly near the edge of the trees. A man, maybe in his late 30s or early 40s, was sitting on a folding chair by a small fire. He looked up as we passed, and we gave each other polite nods. Nothing more, just the kind of brief acknowledgement you give when you're both out in the woods, strangers but sharing the same patch of land for the night. We set up our own camp, got the tent squared away, and let the kids run around the clearing while I gathered some wood. My wife prepped dinner on the camp stove. It was the usual routine, and everything felt normal, ordinary. I noticed the man a couple of times across the way, moving around his small camp, adjusting his fire, disappearing briefly into the woods with what looked like a water filter. He never came over, never tried to make conversation, and that was fine by me. Some people camp to socialize, some people camp to be left alone. By nightfall, we had eaten and were sitting by the fire, roasting marshmallows and telling the kids stories. The woods grew darker, the sky filled with stars, and the forest settled into that quiet rhythm that comes when the day finally ends. Every so often, I caught the glow of the man's fire through the trees. He was still there, still tending his site just as we were. It was sometime after midnight when I woke up. I'm not sure what stirred me. Maybe just the stiffness of sleeping on the ground, maybe a noise outside. The forest was silent except for the faint crackle of our dying fire. Then I heard it, the sound of a vehicle approaching. The road near our site wasn't one that saw much traffic, especially at that hour. The sound of tires on gravel grew louder until headlights briefly cut through the trees. The car stopped near where the man's tent was set up. I lay still, listening. Doors opened and slammed shut. More than one. Then voices, low, muffled, hard to make out. They weren't laughing, they weren't talking casually. The tone was clipped, deliberate. I could hear movement, the shuffle of feet on dirt, something being shifted around. It went on for a few minutes. Then the voices dropped lower until I couldn't catch them at all. I considered unzipping the tent, maybe peeking out, but something about the whole scene made me stay put. My wife stirred next to me, whispering something about hearing a car, but I just held still, listening as the voices carried on for what felt like 10 minutes. Then, just like that, the car doors slammed again. The engine started, and the sound of tires on gravel faded back into the night until it was gone completely. Silence returned. No footsteps, no voices, no more firelight from the man's camp. I lay awake for a long while, staring into the dark fabric of the tent, unsettled but unsure why. Eventually, I drifted back into a restless sleep. In the morning, the first thing I noticed was the quiet. The birds were just beginning to stir, the sun pushing through the trees. I unzipped the tent and stepped outside. Our camp looked the same, the stove, the cooler, the chairs, but across the way where the man had been, everything was different. His tent was down, collapsed flat against the ground. The folding chair, the fire pit, the small pile of gear I had seen gone. There wasn't even smoke from a fire, no sign of ashes. Just bare ground and a crumpled tent lying on its side like it had been dropped there carelessly. I walked a little closer, enough to be sure my eyes weren't playing tricks. There was no trace of him. No backpack, no cooking gear, no cooler, no footprints in the dirt other than the scuffs from where the tent still lay. It was as if he had never been there at all. My wife stepped out of our tent and asked what I was looking at, and I just pointed. The kids were still half asleep, climbing out slowly. The four of us stood there staring at that empty patch of ground, trying to make sense of it. The man had been there. We'd all seen him. We'd nodded to him. His fire had glowed in the night. And then we'd heard the car, the voices, the doors. Now there was nothing. We packed up slowly that morning, but the whole process felt different. The forest didn't feel as calm anymore. It felt strange, hollow, like something had shifted. The kids asked where the man went, and we just told them maybe he left early. But the truth was, nobody leaves a site like that. Tent collapsed, no gear, no fire remains, no car. Not unless they're forced to. As we drove out along the same gravel road, the woods pressed in thick on either side. I couldn't shake the thought of that car pulling in, the doors slamming, the voices in the night. Whoever they were, whatever they had done, they were efficient. They came in, and by morning, it was like the man had been erased. That was years ago, but I still think about it every time I set up a tent. Camping had always felt like a safe escape to me, a place where the only real dangers were weather or wildlife. But that morning taught me something I hadn't wanted to realize. People can vanish in the woods just as quickly as the light fades at night, and sometimes you're the only witness to the fact they were even there. I never reported it. Maybe I should have. Maybe someone else did. But part of me still doesn't know what I heard or saw, and maybe I didn't want to explain it to anyone. All I know is that one evening we shared polite nods with a man at his campfire, and by morning, it was as if he had never existed at all. I went camping alone deep in the backcountry of the Rockies. I had planned the trip for weeks, loading my pack with enough food, water filtration gear, and a lightweight tent to last me 3 days. The weather was mild, crisp in the mornings but warm under the afternoon sun, with skies that stretched endless and blue. The forest around me was thick with pines and spruces, and the ground was soft with needles. There was no sign of anyone else on the trail, which was exactly how I wanted it. Quiet, solitary, just me and the woods. By late afternoon on my first day, I had already hiked about 8 miles in. I found a small clearing not far from a creek and decided it would be my campsite. I dropped my pack, stretched out my sore shoulders, and took in the silence. The only sound was the trickle of water and the occasional call of a jay. I set up my tent facing the creek, gathered wood for a fire, and boiled water for dinner. The air smelled faintly of pine sap and wet earth. As the sun lowered, I noticed how quickly the light bled out of the woods. Shadows stretched long, the trees crowding closer, and the temperature dropped faster than I expected. I built my fire higher and sat near it, eating in silence. I felt the weight of the isolation in those moments, the kind where the quiet makes every small sound sharper. It was when I was cleaning out my pot in the creek that I noticed something. A single paw print in the mud. It was large, far larger than a coyote's, with the deep impression of claws. The size made my chest tighten. I crouched closer. The edges were crisp, not weathered, not old. It was fresh. Wolves had always been in this part of the mountains, though sightings were rare. I reminded myself that attacks on people almost never happen. They avoid us. I told myself that, but even so, the sight of that print made the hair on my arms rise. I scanned the tree line for movement, listening harder. Nothing but stillness. Back at camp, I tried to shake it off. I stoked the fire until it was a tall, steady flame. I sat with my back to the tent so I could face the woods. Darkness thickened until the trees seemed like black walls around me. I couldn't see beyond the fire's glow. The night was colder than I expected, the air biting when the wind shifted. Hours passed like that. I lay in my sleeping bag, listening. The fire had burned down to coals, casting faint red light on the inside of my tent. My ears picked up every sound, the crack of a branch, the rustle of leaves. Then I heard it, a low, distant howl. It echoed faintly through the trees, long and drawn out. My chest tightened again. It was far away, but clear. I lay stiff, waiting, listening. Minutes passed, then another howl, this one sharper, closer. It didn't sound like a lone call. It was answered. Another from farther left. My stomach sank. There was more than one. I told myself wolves cover a lot of ground. They could be miles away. Still, I couldn't shake the unease. I pulled my bag tighter, staring at the dim tent walls. I tried to sleep, but my body refused. Every nerve was awake. The silence after the howls felt heavier than before, like the woods themselves were holding their breath. I must have dozed off at some point, because I woke with my heart pounding. I wasn't sure what had pulled me out of sleep until I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate steps outside my tent. The faint crunch of pine needles, the brush of something against the fabric. I froze, my breath shallow. The steps circled once, then stopped. The smell hit me next, musky, wild like wet fur. My chest felt like it was caving in. I didn't move, didn't breathe, waiting for the sound again. Then I heard the soft huff of air, an exhale, just feet away from where my head lay. For a long time I stayed there, motionless, my pulse hammering in my ears. Eventually, the sound faded. The footsteps receded, quiet at first, then gone. I waited what felt like an eternity before I dared unzip the tent. The night was moonlit, cold, and still. My fire was out, just gray ash. I swept the ground with my headlamp. More prints, large, deep, circling my tent in the dirt. I knew then I wouldn't sleep again. I sat up, clutching my knife, listening to the night. Hours dragged until the first faint blue of dawn touched the treetops. When I stepped outside, the forest looked unchanged, calm even. But the prints were all around camp. I followed them toward the creek and stopped when I realized they didn't just pass through. They lingered. The ground was scuffed, pressed with weight, like something had stood there watching for a long time. I packed up quickly. My hands shook as I shoved gear into my bag. I left nothing behind. As I strapped the pack on, I glanced at the woods one last time. For the first time, I didn't feel like I was alone out there. I felt hunted. The hike out was grueling. Every sound made me turn my head. Every shadow between trees made me tighten my grip on the trekking pole I carried like a weapon. I didn't stop to rest, not once. My legs burned and my throat was dry, but I pushed on. At one point, halfway back to the trailhead, I saw movement in the distance through the trees. A dark shape, low to the ground, keeping pace. When I stopped, it stopped. When I moved, it moved. I couldn't see details, just the outline slipping between trunks. I didn't wait to confirm. I walked faster, almost jogging. The last mile felt endless. The parking area finally came into view, a patch of gravel and my car waiting like a lifeline. I didn't look back. I threw my pack in, slammed the door, and locked it. My hands were trembling so bad I struggled with the keys. When the engine turned over, relief rushed through me so hard I felt lightheaded. Driving out of that forest road, I glanced in the rearview mirror more times than I can count. Nothing followed, nothing emerged from the trees. But the prints, the howls, the shadow keeping pace with me, they've stuck in my head. Wolves rarely attack people. I know that. I've read it enough, told myself enough. But I also know what it feels like to have one circle your camp in the dark, to hear its breath outside your tent. It wasn't curiosity. It was something else, something I don't like to name. That trip cured me of any desire to camp alone again. The woods are wild, and the wild doesn't care if you've come for peace or solitude. Out there, you're not at the top of anything, you're just another body, another moving shape in the trees. And when you hear that low breath outside your tent, you realize how thin the nylon walls are between you and something that sees you not as a camper, but as prey.